Olá, eu sou Laura Seabra, do time de Third Party Distribution da BTG Pactual Asset. O nosso time tem um papel muito importante na escolha e avaliação de gestoras internacionais, oferecendo uma plataforma cheia de opções de fundos globais para os nossos clientes. Hoje vocês vão assistir o segundo episódio da nossa série, que inclui entrevistas com alguns dos gestores que representamos e que participaram da 7ª edição da nossa Global Managers Conference. Hoje a conversa é com Brendan Ahern, CIO da Krane Shares, empresa de investimentos sediada nos Estados Unidos, conhecida por sua gama de ETFs focados em China. A Krane possui aproximadamente 15 bilhões de dólares sob gestão. Seu ETF mais conhecido é o K-Web, que investe no setor de internet chinês. E temos a honra de receber também, para fazer parte da nossa conversa, o nosso gestor e head da mesa de ETFs da BTG Pactual Asset, Eduardo Miquelotti. Eduardo, Brendan, thank you very much for being here with us. I think it's quite important to discuss this asset class that has been gaining increasing relevance in our portfolios. So today, we will explore how these instruments can enhance diversification, efficiency, and risk management across portfolios and in different market environments. So what are the main advantages of using ETFs as a vehicle to gain exposure to global macro themes and evolving market trends?
I mean, certainly exchange-traded funds provide, first and foremost, access to some of these underlying markets can be very difficult to get exposure to. Some of that could be because of country regulations, restrictions on foreign exchange. So mainland China, South Korea, Taiwan actually have a lot of restrictions on foreign inflows. Foreigners have to register. So exchange-traded funds, first and foremost, I always believe it's about access, but then certainly ETFs tend to have lower fees than active managers because they're passive, they track an index. But they also provide transparency, so you actually know exactly what you own versus mutual funds might have different schedules on when they show you some or all of their holdings. And then historically, there's been some tax efficiencies to the ETF structure of how the creation redemption process, and then obviously the intraday trading that you're not beholden to a 4 o'clock close, that you're able to transact during market hours. So there's a whole host of benefits to the ETF structure.
Perfect. Edu, what's your view?
I would complement that. Of course, probably will be cheaper to invest in that kind of company, offshore companies. Probably be easier to invest. In example, if you can buy only one share of an ETF here in Brazil, you probably will be investing in more than 10, 20, 30 or 100 companies at the same time with lower price, great liquidity, and like Brandon said, with transparency. So I think it's a great product to be allocated.
Now, how do ETFs facilitate access to markets and sectors that would be difficult to invest in directly?
Yeah, and certainly for ourselves, the Shanghai, Shenzhen, the A-share market historically has required first a quota system that's migrated to a Stock Connect program. But MSCI's definition of Shanghai and Shenzhen stocks is hundreds of securities. So as an investor, how do I take an investment portfolio and that maybe the China section is just a small piece, invest it across hundreds, but with pushing one keystroke on your keyboard, via say KBA or China A fund, you're buying hundreds of these Chinese A shares on the other side of the planet. You don't have to worry about the FX conversion. We're doing all of that work for you. So I think that access element, and then obviously we're doing a lot of that government regulatory on your behalf, some of the local tax. You're getting all of that embedded in your fee. I think it's actually it's a great deal.
I totally agree. In example, if the Brazilian investors would like to invest in offshore countries, you can say, or in the US or even in the China market, it's really difficult to them to know how to invest or know which type of equity or assets they would like to invest. And when you are buying Krane Shares ETF, an example, you are buying at the same time all the expertise from the Krane Shares, all the more than years of technology to create the methodology, develop the index, and manage the ETF. So it's really important to use that type of access to invest in offshore, so you can guarantee you are buying a great product.
Perfect. Edu, what are the main challenges and opportunities in managing a fixed income ETF in the Brazilian market, especially in a scenario of high volatility and changing interest rates?
Perfect. So, in my opinion, the Brazilian ETF market, we are in a really early stage right now. So we are in a great momentum to develop new products, and all the investors are starting to getting more information about how ETF works, all the benefits, and how I'd like to invest. So we are doing a lot of education projects in Brazilian market right now. And when you're talking about the fixed income ETFs, as everybody knows, we are a country which has a high interest rates and high inflation. So we have great opportunity to launch and manage and give the product, give access to the investors to great fixed income ETFs. BTG Pactual today, we are the only manager in Brazil who has private credit ETFs. We have DEB 11 and March 11. So both ETFs, the first one, DEB 11, it has more than 3 years of track record with great returns, and all the inflation-linked ETF as well. So the idea here is give access and give a great instrument so we can facilitate the investors to have exposure to great interest rates with a great product, great liquidity, lower price, like we said in the beginning. So our idea here is to give good instruments to our investors, and BTG Pactual right now has awesome products to show today.
Perfect. Brendan, how have recent regulatory changes and geopolitical tensions impacted the management of your China-focused ETF? And what strategies do you employ to mitigate these risks?
Yeah, I think a big part of what's facing a lot of investors is navigating some of these geopolitical challenges. So one, to Eduardo's point, we spend a lot of time providing research on, what's happening in the U.S. as well as what's happening in China in terms of the geopolitical, if it's the trade war. We're going to Beijing, we're going to Washington, D.C., and meeting with both governments. So we're able to keep investors apprised of what is the mindset of these two superpowers and how are they going to coexist going forward. But there's another element, which is that we're imparting U.S. regulations within our exchange traded funds. So many global institutions, they do business in the U.S. They have offices, and so they will always want to ensure that they're adhering to the highest standards of U.S. regulation, U.S. law. And so we spend a lot of time going to Washington, D.C., and all of that is embedded in our exchange traded funds, where we're adhering to an evolving situation. We're not deferring to our index providers. We're actually spending a lot of time double checking, triple checking adherence. And so that's why I think part of the reason we've seen such adoption of our China ETFs by global institutions. It's a value add that is just embedded in the fee.
Perfect. And are there specific sectors or companies within ETFs that you see as being underestimated or overhyped in the current environment?
I think for a big thing that's happening that's exciting is the U.S. equity market over the last 16 years has outperformed non-U.S. equities really significantly, and that's been that U.S. outperformance has been further enhanced by a very strong U.S. dollar. So U.S. equities have had this huge tailwind of outperformance, and then aided by a strong, and there's signs that we're in a period of regime change, market leadership regime change, where the year to date, a lot of non-U.S. equity markets are outperforming the U.S. The U.S. dollar is underperforming a lot of currencies, the euro, the Japanese yen. And so we're starting to see a global rebalance. And I think some of that will end up here in Brazil. Some of it will end up in in China and European equities. So I think there's a little bit of a global rebalancing. And for us, we've seen since DeepSeek, I think there was a big pillar of this U.S. equity outperformance was American exceptionalism, that all of this AI would only be dominated by U.S. firms, and DeepSeek really did prove that there's a lot of innovation happening in China, and that's been an area since day one of Krane Shares, 12 years ago, that I've been focused on, is these growth elements within China's economy and capital markets that historically have been really underrepresented in a broad benchmark like MSCI China. So we've always been focused on bringing you that growth factor for China, the fast growing parts of China's capital markets. And I think because of DeepSeek, we're seeing a lot of uptake and interest from global institutions in Europe, in Asia, as well as here in Brazil.
I would complement on the local market here is, if you take a look, the fixed income funds in Brazil is the largest market in Brazilian industry right now. And when we are doing a parallel with the fixed income ETFs, is still really shy here, it's still small. So I truly believe that we will have a lot of space to grow in the next few years. And a new vertical that a lot of products probably will be launched in the next months or years. It will be multi-asset ETFs here in Brazil. So the Brazilian managers are starting to launch it right now. So I truly believe that will grow a lot in the next few months or years.
Edu, in that sense, how do you compare ETF allocations in US versus Brazil? And what do you think is the potential of this asset class for Brazilian investors, considering the current landscape?
Me and Brendan, we were talking a little bit before here about this parallel of the US market and the Brazilian market. And if you guys take a look, I believe in September last year, the ETF market, it's higher than 50% market share in the US market right now, right? And the Brazilian market today, the ETFs, it's less than 1% in the Brazilian market. So I think the opportunity here is probably when all the investors is starting to know a little bit more about ETFs, they will start to invest in local ETFs or in offshore ETFs like Krane ETFs, and this 1% probably will start to increase, and I don't know if in Brazilian market we will achieve 50% like we have in US market, but 100% sure that this market share will increase in the next few years, and we have a lot of new products, a lot of new opportunities to the investors to create their portfolios using ETFs in Brazil with BRL exposure, or ETFs in Brazil with USD exposure, or other currency exposure with Chinese companies, with other countries' companies. So we are going deep to create and give more products to the investors. So that's where I think we should be in the next few years. Here.
Brendan, as market sentiment is still fragile, how should investors think about timing their exposure to Chinese or thematic ETFs?
I think we've been in a rally in Chinese equities, but not every investor has noticed that since mid-January 2024, our flagship ETF, KWEB, is up actually over 50%. And I think if you ask most investors, what do you think Chinese stocks have done in the last year and a half? They'd say down 50. But that's outperforming the S&P 500. It's outperforming the NASDAQ 100 very significantly, by almost twice the exposure. So we're in this sleeper bull market, and I think that's kind of what gets me excited, that we're in an uptrend, but the asset class is still under-owned as well as unloved. And I think those are that's the secret sauce for a bull market, because as more investors recognize that the China market is outperforming the US market really significantly, as well as if you're a foreign investor, your US dollar assets are maybe underperforming. And so I think that the combination is investors are rediscovering diversification, and I think an element of this market regime change rebalance, money will flow out of the US to Europe, to Asia, to South America, and some of that will end up in Brazil, some of it will end up in China. So I think we're in an education process of trying to tell people of what's happening, that the second largest economy in the world is stimulating. And the government is saying, here's what we want to accomplish. And I think that story is still very, very early in being widely recognized.
Perfect, thank you. Edu, to end our conversation, would you like to share a final message?
I would like to thank you, Laura and Brendan, for having me today. It was a pleasure to share a little bit more about the ETF environment. And I would suggest to our investors to keep focus on what are new on the ETF markets right now, because I truly believe that we'll have a lot of new products going on in the next few months and years. So thank you again.
Brendan.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think, you know, I was part of Barclays Global Investors when they started their ETF business back in 2001. And we started this industry really at nothing. And I look at Eduardo and see an earlier version of myself, of a young man who's, really learning this whole industry. And that was something that I experienced myself being part of iShares very, very early. And I think, today, a lot of what Eduardo is bringing to investors here locally is that knowledge base, that understanding of this entire ecosystem and the intricacies. And, that's something that really was very formative in my career of being part of Barclays Global Investors and then BlackRock and then, being part of building Krane Shares. And so I think education, the E in exchange traded funds stands for equity, exchange. But I think there's always been an argument that it's about education. And I think leveraging, experts like Eduardo on this, really exciting opportunity, the growth of ETFs here locally in Brazil. And certainly for us at Krane Shares, my focus has always been on the China business and trying to help investors navigate what's happening in terms of the Chinese government, U.S. geopolitical, but certainly the economy and the capital markets. And I think for both Eduardo's career and my career, there's job security and investors needing the insights on those two parallel issues.
So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you both here with us. Obrigada a todos que estiveram com a gente aqui. Se quiserem saber mais sobre a Krane Shares ou sobre a nossa mesa de ETFs da BTG Pactual Asset, entre em contato. Até mais!